A week or so ago, as I sat in my car at a busy, complex intersection, many lanes going in many directions, I heard a car horn. To be clear, I couldn't not hear the car horn. It was so loud and so long and so insistent that it was at first completely impossible to tell where it was coming from. Was it behind me or in front of me? Was it coming from a nearby parking lot? Because it was coming from everywhere at once. Now, car horns are a way of communicating. A gentle tap on the car horn might remind the driver in front of us to cease their daydreaming and move forward because the light has turned green. Or driving on the beltway, a more urgent, brief blast of the horn might signal to an unaware driver, "Don't change lanes, I'm here, we're about to have a collision." But this horn was no gentle reminder, nor even an urgent warning. It wasn't communicating helpful information, it was communicating unhelpful emotion. It was malevolent. It was outraged. It was meant to browbeat and humiliate the other driver. I finally located where it was coming from. Across the way, an older gentleman had gotten confused or lost, and he was in the wrong lane. He was trying to get over, but in the steady flow of traffic, he was struggling to do so, briefly holding up the traffic. And the car behind him, well, the driver was leaning on the horn with all of the wrath and the rage he could muster, which was a lot. The hand that wasn't blaring the horn was giving all variety of helpful directional gestures. And the confused gentleman looked as if he were nearly about to cry. The ceaseless car horn was only distracting him and paralyzing him. He knew he was holding up traffic. He was trying to do something. Finally, someone spotted the problem, kindly let the lost gentleman over, and the driver behind him rushed on in an indignant rage with a final extended blast of the horn to punctuate his displeasure, as if to say, "I wish you all manner of ill." And I thought, wow, that was uncharitable. What in the world was in him to come out in that way? Was the unintentional infraction so egregious and so unpardonable that it merited that kind of response? It was an utter absence of generosity of spirit. I would define generosity of spirit as striving to readily pardon others, assuming their best intentions, forgiving unintended infractions, choosing kindness when there is a choice to be made between kindness and ugliness. But generosity of spirit is more, it seems, than just acting nice. It's a way of being and a way of seeing, an intentional cultivation of our best selves. If there is such a thing as a generous spirit, there's also the opposite. I read a sermon once by the great preacher Barbara Brown Taylor in which she spoke of arthritis of the spirit, an illness that is born of harboring resentments, building up anger, cultivating a righteous and rage-filled protective shell that twists the outlook, twists the countenance, and twists the behavior of a person. Now, it should be said that anyone can become temporarily angry. Anyone can feel hurt or resentful. Anyone can speak or act unkindly. As humans, we experience every emotion. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh describes that our mind is like a field where every kind of seed is planted. Seeds of suffering, of anger, of happiness and peace, every human emotion. And over time, the quality of our life or the state of our spirit depends on which seeds we water. Is our anger momentary? or do we cultivate our anger? Is any resentment we may feel fleeting, or do we grow resentment? Do we sit in harsh judgment of others, or do we strive to forgive? This, I think, is what Jesus is seeking to teach in our scripture lesson from Luke's gospel. That you grow what you water, and you harvest what you sow. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. And it makes sense based upon the parable Jesus tells. Can a blind person guide a blind person? Will not both fall into a pit? If I am blinded by my anger, how can I lead you out of yours? We'll both fall into a pit of anger. If I am blinded by unforgiveness, how can I lead another out of that state? We'll both fall into a pit of resentment. But if I change my behavior, only then can I helpfully impact my neighbor's response. Why do you notice the speck in your neighbor's eye, the source of their blindness, but do not notice the log in your own eye, the source of my blindness? First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly. Then you can be helpful. Then you won't both fall into error. And Jesus goes on to say, no good tree bears bad fruit. Figs are not gathered from thorns, nor grapes from a bramble bush. The good person out of the good treasure of the heart produces good. And the evil person out of evil treasure, like anger, resentment, judgment, produces evil. For it's out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. So all of that's philosophically good stuff. But how is it practically attained? In other words, how do I make sure that I am storing up the good treasure, watering the good seeds, cultivating a generous spirit? Well, first, I suggest the simple practice of self-care. If I don't remain mindful of my sleep, I am not my best self. If I don't find ways to exercise or de-stress, I'm not my best self. If I don't process my emotions in a healthy way by talking with a friend or a confidant or a counselor, I risk processing them in an unhealthy way, like with my car horn. If I'm practicing proper self-care, I'm watering the good seed, and I am cultivating over time a generous spirit. Secondly, I can make choices about what I consume. What sort of information and how much of it am I taking in? What sort of emotions am I swimming in? I went through a period not long ago where I found myself, Amy can attest to this, kind of moody and mad compared to normal. At least moodier and madder than usual. And eventually I realized I was listening to news radio on the way into work and on the way home from work. And throughout the day, from time to time, I was pulling up a news website to see what was afoot in the world. I'd come home, start to cook supper, and turn on the news. And I do that to try to stay current. I do it to try to keep my preaching relevant to what's going on in the world. But all the punditry, all the outrage, doesn't matter what your political flavor is, there is plenty of outrage out there. Much of it's manufactured. I wasn't able to process it. And even if the news wasn't political, it was often just stressful. A shooting here, a wildfire there, man bites dog, dog bites man. It was making me tired, and it was souring my spirit. I didn't start ignoring the news and being intentionally uninformed, but I did change my consumption of it. Music on the car radio, Turn off the TV once in a while and read a good book. If I am constantly consuming outrage and negativity, how can I possibly generate generosity and positivity? Thirdly, I can practice perspective taking. If a person says or does something that affronts me, why might he or she be acting or speaking as they are? Might things appear differently from where they stand? Do I assign to them malign intentions or innocent ones? To return to the example of a car horn in the beginning of my sermon, what if the other driver had practiced just a little perspective taking? The person in front of me must be lost or confused. I've been lost or confused before. They aren't merely stupid or intentionally seeking to cause harm. Using perspective taking, I can even use my imagination to seek a better perspective. My coworker is being unpleasant. Might they be under stress, or worried, or hurting, or in an unhealthy place? How can I reframe my understanding of this situation in the best possible light? It doesn't make their behavior palatable, but it may make it pardonable. I'll say that again. It doesn't make the behavior palatable, but it may make it pardonable. Lastly and importantly, I can guard my words. This is deserving of a scripture passage unto itself because words make and shape and form and create worlds. James speaks of the tongue being like the rudder of a ship. What I speak gives direction to my attitude. What I say shapes how others respond to me. I cannot cultivate a generous spirit with ungenerous words. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? And for all of you out there who are Southern like me, you can't say whatever you want and then soften it by saying, bless his heart. Unkind words will never grow from good spiritual seed. As I think about the generosity of the Spirit, I'm struck by these words from our James passage. Who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly and unspiritual and devilish. Where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. Lastly, there's just one thing that I will continue to return to as we continue to contemplate generosity in the weeks to come. That my generosity is not just an act of will on my part. It's rooted in the generosity of God. God is unfailingly generous, giving and forgiving and gracious and loving. And the more fully I know God's generosity and God's forgiveness and God's love, the more I will display generosity and forgiveness and love. If I receive and recognize God's overflowing reservoir of grace, it will be ever more evident in my life and in my spirit. So this sermon comes with homework. A challenge this week for each of us. Where do we encounter God's generosity in the week to come? How can we become more mindful of it? And how can we intentionally cultivate a more generous spirit? One hint: we can start by laying off the car horn. Amen.